This is the Provoked Prawn, here to show you how to install and wire RGB fans in your PC build. I want to talk to you about the various different things that are worth knowing because it is different from fan to fan, and there are some caveats depending on what fans you're building with, whether it's Corsair, NZXT or other. And I want to talk to you about the things that you need to know to make your life a little bit easier, as well as explaining the basic wiring logic. NZXT, for example, requires a controller, as does Lian Li. However, Lian Li's uni fans are a little bit more straightforward because they're interlocking fans that, generally speaking, only have one wire to worry about once you get to the end of them, which makes them really easy to set up. However, each of these brands offers a different setup process. You'll see that Corsair's RGB fans, at least the standard ones, come with two cables, one for fan power and one for RGB. However, the easiest way to actually install Corsair fans is inevitably with a commander core, which is a controller that does both. Now, you can use an RGB hub, but it's so much easier to use a commander core because this takes both the RGB connection and the power connection for the fans. And you can install a mass of fans on there. As you can see, you've got loads of different connectors. Now, NZXT also has a similar logic. However, both NZXT and Corsair use proprietary connectors, which means that you need an NZXT controller for NZXT fans and a Corsair commander for Corsair fans. So it can get a little bit complicated, and there are their own caveats to those. So I've done separate wiring guides for both Corsair and NZXT that I'll link to in the description, but I'm also going to quickly give you an overview of them a little bit later in the video and talk to you about the easiest way to get these fans set up if that's what you're after, because NZXT, for example, also has a controller that you can see here. However, this can only in theory control 9 fans power and 6 RGB, which then means if you're using 10 fans, it becomes a little bit trickier, and so not ideal. But that does mean there's a controller that manages all the fan cables, which means that you can plug them in at the back of your PC and still control the RGB lighting and end up with a really nice looking case with good RGB on it and easy to control settings. Now, those are those brands, but if you're buying another one, so if you buy more standard fans with an easier setup, then you might get lucky. These MSI fans are actually reverse blade fans, but they're ARGB fans, and those have 2 cables in the traditional way. So they have one for power and one for RGB. You'll often find that different brands have similar fans. So these Antec ones, for example, also have power and RGB. The thing that makes these similar, though, is they both use the same connector. You've got one fan power and one RGB connector that uses a 5-volt RGB header, as do these Fractal Design fans, which also have an RGB connection on them, which uses a 5-volt connector. If you're lucky enough to have fans that use a 5-volt connector, then good news, because they should be fairly easy to install. You will need a motherboard that supports a 5-volt header, though. So I'm going to show you some examples. You want to look for the 5-volt header on there. You can see them in various different places. In this instance, marked Gen 2 ADD or 5-volt RGB and RGB header. You may find them in the top, middle, bottom, all over the place on your motherboard. You see this one, JARGB V2_1. You have to refer to your manual for it, but it's a 3-pin header, and those cables from the fans generally plug into them. Now, you're often limited to maybe 2 of these connectors per motherboard, which can make things a bit more complicated, and I'll provide a solution for that a little later on. But otherwise, a fan itself connects to that, and then the fan power, which I'll show you in a minute, connects elsewhere. However, some fans, these MSI fans, for example, have 2 RGB connectors on them, one male with the pins coming out of it and one female, and that's because they're daisy chainable. So you can connect these fans from one fan to the next by connecting up what is otherwise the 5-volt RGB connection that you've just seen on the motherboard together. So you can either wire one fan directly to the motherboard, or you can connect the fans together. So just create a chain. One fan goes to one fan, the next fan goes to the next, and so on and so forth. So you then have a group of fans. Now, in this instance, on this radiator, the final fan in that group then actually connects to the pump head, so that you can actually connect the RGB from the pump as well. So that's got RGB on it too. So that is then in that system. And then the final female connector, which is on the other end, can then connect directly to the motherboard on that 5-volt RGB header that I showed you earlier on. And then all the lighting for all 3 fans and for the pump head is then controllable via your motherboard software. So Asus's Armoury Crate, MSI's Mystic Light, and other things, so you can all control it like that. So that's that logic, fairly straightforward. Again, I'll show you another solution if you've got loads of them in a minute. And you also then need to worry about fan power, obviously, as an alternative. So these fans from Antec have fan power connectors. We've got 3 power connectors. I'd recommend using a fan splitter for those. You can get these splitters, either Y splitters, which is 2 into 1, or more, so 3 fans into 1 connection. You use these, you can buy them as optional accessories, or sometimes, if you're lucky, they'll come with the device you've purchased. And then you've got a single fan connector on the other end. This connects up to the sys fan header or chassis fan header, or if it's on a radiator, the CPU fan. But if you're using case fans, you'd want to look for sys fan as the place to connect those fans up. Well, what do you do if you only have 1 or 2 RGB headers on your motherboard? That's not enough if you've got, let's say, 10 fans in your case. Well, the solution invariably is an RGB controller, and there are some different options I want to talk about that quickly show you things that could be handy for the solution to your problem here. In order to do this, I'm going to use Montech's RGB fans as a demonstration for this, because they use the 5-volt RGB header with a 3-pin connection and your standard system fan header for power. And so this will make an easy demonstration of the easiest way to do this if you're planning on using similar fans to this, or indeed these fans. And this classic setup makes life a lot easier in theory, because what you're going to need is a couple of controllers or 1 single controller. So I'm going to show you some different options, because this will be useful depending on how many fans you're using. You can see I've got quite a few fans here, for example. If you have more than that, you may have even more considerations. Now, with these fans, you plug in the 5-volt RGB cable to the 5-volt header on your motherboard, and then the other cable into a system fan header or chassis fan header on your motherboard. And then, obviously, you just repeat that process for all the fans you're planning on connecting. However, what you will find quite quickly is that although you may have enough system fan headers, especially if you're using splitters, your 5-volt RGB headers may soon run out. I've just used 3 on this motherboard, now there's none left, so you can't connect a 4th fan. Here comes a solution in the form of this Thermalright RGB hub. So this is a powered RGB hub, which basically takes multiple RGB connections, not just fans, but anything that requires a 5-volt RGB header. So include, for example, lighting strips as a solution. And you can see that you've got multiple ports on here, so you can actually plug in 10 RGB things to it. It then requires SATA power from your power supply unit, and then it has a cable included in the box, which you plug into the end here, as you can see, ARGB input. You plug your 5-volt cable into there that's included with this controller, and then you plug the other end onto the single 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard. This controller then allows you to power the RGB lighting and control it for 10 fans or 10 devices connected to it without having to worry about filling up the ports on your motherboard. So simple connection, fairly straightforward, and as you can see, if you've got loads of fans, let's say 10 fans, this is a good solution. I'll leave links in the description to all of the things that I'm showing in this video so you can find them easily in your region, and it'll make your life a lot easier. But in theory, this is a great bit of kit. Obviously, you need SATA power, so that's the same connection from your hard disk drive or SSDs, and then the other end plugs into your motherboard. But then you just connect all the lighting connections from the fans to this little controller. The system fan headers for the fan speed, you could use fan splitters, or in a minute I'll show you a fan controller as an alternative option. But if you're trying to keep costs down, or you just want to control the RGB lighting for a number of different fans, then this Thermalright RGB hub makes a lot of sense. Also looks really nice until you get fingerprints all over it, but that's unrelated. And you can obviously nestle this away at the back of your case, then just run this single cable through to the motherboard, plug it into that 5-volt RGB header on the motherboard, whichever one works for you best. I'm using the bottom middle one for this, for example, and showing you the wiring logic for that. And make sure you plug in the SATA power cable as well. And then you've got that powered, and then the RGB lighting for all fans is then covered. So you can see fairly straightforward setup. Now, I'm not even using all the ports on this, but if you had 10 fans, you could plug all 10 in there and then all of them are then lit up, as you can see from that connection. This is just for the RGB lighting though. If we need to power those fans as well, then maybe you want to get this as an extra purchase too. This is a Thermalright fan hub, so it's a fan controller with PWM controls, and you can see you can plug in 10 fans to this. It has much the same logic as the RGB controller in that it requires SATA power, and obviously you connect all your fans to it from the fan power cables, and then there's a PWM input on the end, which the cable is included with this, and then you plug that into that, and then plug it into a system fan header on your motherboard, then set it to PWM mode, and then you can control the speed of all the fans from this single controller. This really makes it easier, makes cable management easier as well, because in theory you're just using one header instead of all of the different headers on your motherboard. You can put this at the back of your case. It has a sticker, double-sided sticker that you can stick it to the back somewhere, as does the RGB controller. Then you just need power for it and the RGB controller. And then you've got the power and RGB lighting for 10 fans controlled by these two little controllers that are run to the back. Obviously, it's all still adjusted via your motherboard software and your BIOS, but it's powered from these devices, and it means the wiring is a lot more simple in theory. So you can see plug in loads of different fans into this. If you've got loads of fans in your case, these two devices will make life a lot easier if they are RGB fans in the usual traditional sense. Obviously, 2 controllers might not be for everybody, but it does give you the power for 10 fans, which is quite a lot and probably enough for most cases. So these little control boxes are pretty handy, and as you can see, fairly easy to install as well. Now, alternatively, if you'd rather have just one box, you can get an ARGB and fan hub from Thermalright. Now, this only controls 8 fans, so it's worth bearing in mind that this does both in one box, slightly larger as you can imagine. The same sort of logic, but it's all in one, so it does RGB and fan power in one controller. You plug all the fans into it, and then again you plug in the same sort of cable logic. So you've got your 5-volt RGB header and a system fan header controller in there. Plug those into your motherboard, and system power from the power supply unit as well. And then you can control all the fans, lighting and RGB from this one box. However, it will only control up to 8. So you've got 2 less than if you had the 2 controllers. So if you've got a lot of fans, more than 8, then you might want to consider that. Maybe getting 2 of these or 2 of the other controllers I've shown you might be the better option. But all these systems, as you can see, are fairly simple to install and pretty logical, and make life a lot easier if you've got a load of fans that aren't daisy chainable. So sensible purchase, and a reasonably affordable one. I bought all of these things from Amazon, and they came really quickly, so they're easy to get and they're easy to set up. A benefit as well is with these, there is no additional software required, so you don't need to download anything because there's no connection via USB. So you're not looking for Thermalright software, you're just using your motherboard software and the BIOS settings for the fan speed, making sure you adjust those things and tweaking them in there. So if you're using for the RGB, it'll be MSI Mystic Light, Azusa's Armory Crate, Gigabyte Control Center, whatever else. And then you do the fan power through those bits of software or through your BIOS, and then you can just tweak the settings in there. But simple solution, fairly straightforward, and hopefully really useful to you. Once you've got this set up and you've finished building your PC, what you want to do is go into the BIOS by mashing the delete key when you turn it on, and then find the hardware monitor and fan settings. You want to make sure that the connections that you've set up, so from the control boxes for the system fans, where they've plugged it in, you want to set it to PWM mode instead of DC. So find your system fan headers and set it to PWM mode. This will give you control over the fan speed through the controller and allow you to adjust the speed of the fans. It will obviously affect all of the fans at once if they're plugged into the controller, but reducing and maximizing the speed, and also just choosing the right sort of fan curve for it. Now you can do this in the BIOS, but you can also set the settings in your relevant software within Windows, so you can tweak that there too. But hopefully this will help with those. And now let's have a look at NZXT's fans, which use proprietary cables rather than those 5-volt RGB connectors. Now if you buy a triple pack of 120mm or a dual pack of 140mm, then you get a RGB controller, which I'll talk to you about in a second. But as standard, the fan has 2 cables coming out of it, a RGB cable and a fan power cable. These require 2 different connections on your motherboard or with a controller, and that's the important point, get the controller, I'll link to it in the description, that then connect to your motherboard and allow you to control the RGB lighting and the fan speed. The usual setup for most RGB fans is that with your motherboard, you would look for a 5-volt RGB head on your motherboard, which has 3 pins on it in various different positions around the motherboard, and you'd then plug your RGB cable into that. Do not try and plug your NZXT cable into that. This will not work. And most motherboards do not have the right connector, so don't try and use this one. That's my biggest clue to you. Don't do that. The NZXT connector is designed for NZXT motherboards specifically, so if you happen to have one of those, well done you, but otherwise you won't be able to connect the fan directly to the motherboard, so don't try. Now, the logic with NZXT motherboards is there's a specific connector for the RGB one, so you can see NZXT RGB 1 is the clear marking on that. It's a 4-pin connector, and it's designed specifically for these fans. So you take the RGB connector for the fan and plug it into that, and then you take the fan power one and plug it into a system fan header on the motherboard, and that's how you connect a single fan. Obviously, you're going to want to connect more fans than that, so I'm going to show you how to do that in a really simple way. Now, with the triple pack or the twin pack, you have the RGB controller included as standard, which can take the RGB connection for 3 fans. So 3 fans can be plugged into it and then controlled via NZXT's CAM software. You plug your fans in, just the RGB, not fan power notes. That makes it a bit more complicated. And then you plug in the USB cable from that controller to your motherboard. Now, obviously, this only powers 3 fans for the RGB lighting. So if you have multiples of these, you're going to need multiple USB headers on your motherboard or a controller, which is a separate consideration, and things get a little bit more complicated. So you can soon fill up these ports, especially if you've got multiple RGB fans in your case. The other connector is the SATA power connector, which is the same one which controls SSDs and hard disk drives. That comes from your power supply unit, and that connects up to the RGB controller as well. And obviously you'll need multiple cables for multiple controllers, so it's worth bearing that in mind as well. So you can see how complicated this is if you have, let's say, 10 fans in your case. So the easiest solution for NZXT fans is instead to get NZXT's fan controller. This enables you to control the RGB lighting for 6 fans and the power for 9 fans. So you can see this thing has multiple ports on it that you can connect your fans up to. You can use fan splitters, so you can see this triple fan splitter, for example, on each of the fan power ports, which means that you can power up to 9 fans, so just the power, not the RGB, by connecting those up to ports 1, 2, and 3 on here, with splitters on each of those ports, and that takes the place of plugging them into the system fan headers on your motherboard. So this makes life a lot easier. It keeps the cables away from the front, and it also makes powering the fans much more simple than having to worry about motherboard connections. Then you plug in the RGB connectors from each of the fans, and again you can have up to 6 fans on here, and that's the most straightforward solution. This in turn needs SATA power and again a USB connection to your motherboard. And if you're running low on USB connections, because let's say you have other devices in there, not to worry, just get this NZXT USB hub. This takes a single connector and then allows you to connect up 4 USB connections to it. Now it's a powered hub, which means it needs to be separately powered, but you can plug in the NZXT fan controllers, let's say 2 of them if you needed to, and other things, maybe an AIO pump or whatever else you'll plug into it. You can plug all those things in and then just simply connect this to the motherboard and then to your power supply unit, and then that solves that headache. So it's essentially a couple of extra things you'd have to buy to go along with your NZXT fans, but this will streamline the process, make it much easier to set up and far easier to manage all the cables. And then you'll also have a much easier time of it in getting the RGB lighting to work, because you can then download and use NZXT's CAM software and can control all the fans from there directly, rather than having to use your motherboard software and messing about with the fan speeds and the BIOS or the fan RGB lighting through your motherboard software or whatever else you want to use, and you end up with a really nice looking case. When it comes to Corsair fans, I'm talking not IQ Link fans, but the standard Corsair RGB fans. You have much the same logic as you do with NZXT. There's 2 cables, one for RGB and one for fan power. However, like NZXT's, Corsair's RGB cables are kind of proprietary, and they have 2 RGB hub on them. Now, if you buy a triple pack of fans from Corsair, you get the RGB hub included. That RGB hub will only take up to 6 fans, so it'll do the RGB and just the RGB, not the fan power. You then need a USB connection and SATA power, and then you'd need to wire the fans separately in terms of the power for the spinning of the fans themselves. So you could use splitter cables if you wanted to keep your costs down. You could connect up 3 fans to a splitter cable, then connect that up to a system fan header or chassis fan header, and that would work, but obviously you'd need multiples of those, and if you've got a lot of fans, you're going to end up with a lot of cables and a lot of mess potentially. But sadly, that's the only way you have it out of the box to be able to do this, and it is a little bit fiddly. What Corsair wants, and the best way to do it, is for you to buy a Commander core. This only controls the fan power and RGB lighting for up to 6 fans, so keep that in mind because you might need 2 of them depending on how many fans you're putting into your case. But you plug the RGB on one side and the fan power on the other side, and then you connect up this controller to your motherboard with a USB connection and to your power supply with a SATA power, and then you can control all the RGB lighting. And each fan is recognized individually in Corsair's IQ software, so you can control the RGB lighting and fan speed of each individually, so it gives you more granular control than it would otherwise, and makes life a little bit more flexible in terms of the synchronization and tweaking of things. However, as I said, you can plug in 6 fans into this. So if you have 10 fans, you might need 2 controllers. Then you've got a SATA power connection and a USB connection for each. You might end up with 2 USB connectors, and maybe you've only got 1 on your motherboard, so you might need to buy a USB hub, a powered one. Corsair does them, as does NZXT. I've used both and they're both pretty good, so I'll leave links down in the description below so you can find out more. But those are the easiest ways to get those fans wired. If you want to find out more about wiring Corsair fans, check out the link in the description to my detailed guide on the AF120 RGB Elites. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, subscribe and let me know in the comments down below what you think the best fans are. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.